Hello, BookTube, and welcome to what I used to refer to as a bleak and barren Sunday, because I don't get any mail on Sundays. I don't get any free books in the mail on Sundays. I've stopped calling Sundays bleak and barren because I have fallen into a very nice habit of read-alongs and other communal events like that just feel wonderful. They really are, to me, the heart and soul of BookTube. So I'm doing two of them this Sunday and every Sunday in February. And the first is Sagalong, which is a month-long appreciation of the Icelandic sagas that was thought up by Elena Makridina, and we're joined by a whole bunch of good booktubers, in which we talk about a different saga every week. And there are enough Icelandic sagas so that we could do this until summer's end if we wanted to. In fact, a couple of people have emailed me, a couple of people, in fact, who are viewers of my channel, but not booktubers, not YouTubers, don't really understand the word at all, don't really know, as a lot of my older friends will confess once the wine has been flowing, don't really know what I'm doing here. A lot of them have pointed out, well, what on earth is going on here? You're celebrating the Icelandic sagas, but you've shown me the roster, and there aren't any truly great ones on it. And that's the point I wanted to make, is that we could just keep going. We could, the big, operatically, literarily magnificent Icelandic sagas aren't even touched this time around. When we do Sagalong next year, maybe one of them will be. Maybe we'll all do the same one at the same time. They could certainly take that kind of attention. But today, we're doing King Harald Saga, which is a broken off chunk of a much longer work by Snorri Sturluson called Heimskringla. He didn't call it that. That isn't his actual name. That's just sort of a shorthand that has come down to us over 1,000 years, because that's a part of its first line, signifying, as the translation of that line does, that Heimskringla is everything. It's the whole history of the world, from the birth of the gods and Ask and Embla, the original man and woman, all the way down to the royal house of Norway. Because that's how humans write such books. They don't ever write such books in which they themselves are insignificant. No. Instead, all of creation is laboring to bring forth them. And that is true in the Heimskringla. And the reason I know that, since I can't read it in the original, the reason I know that is because I read a wonderful old Dover Classic edition translation of the Heimskringla that had illustrations all throughout, and the translation was a little bit labored, and it certainly didn't take any artistic chances, whereas Snorri Sturluson's book does. And if you detect a slight hint of irritation in my voice when I talk about that old Dover edition, you're right. And it's not because of the Dover edition, it's because where are the other editions? Where are all the other editions of Heimskringla? Where's the Penguin Classic at 1,000 pages of Heimskringla with a brand new introduction, tons of notes, maybe, spring the extra $150 and buy those illustrations and sprinkle them throughout the text. It's a massive work. Even in the distorted and, I'm sure, lessened viewpoint of that old Dover edition, I could still tell this is one of the masterpieces of world literature. So why isn't it treated that way? This is one fragment of that. This is the story of King Harald Hardrada, who, when you're reading Heimskringla, you get a sense, when you're reading it, you get a sense that certain parts of it are more polished and more self-contained, and were probably meant to be that way, and they invariably are broken off from the book to make little books like this Penguin Classic. This is translated by Magnus Magnusson, who is a better translator than my last one, although I still felt like the translator was in the room for this. This is a story, the life story of a man who has been dubbed by innumerable historical novels in the last 100 years as the last Viking. King Harald Hardrada, Hardrada was his nickname, and as you could probably sort of suss it out just from the sound of the nickname, it was extremely accurate. It means hard ass. It means bad news for your enemies. It means hard ruler. And he lived up to that. In case you're wondering, I'm waving around the old Penguin Classic, and that is Harold on the horse. And look at the size of the horse's eye. That horse is not happy to be being led into battle. But Harold there's a shorthand for him. And The Last Viking is actually 2 words too long for that summary. There's a shorthand that you could give someone who doesn't know anything about Harald Hardrada that would summarize him almost perfectly. And that summary is Conan. This guy's life is much more interesting than the mythology that has sprung up around him. We don't know for sure whether or not he starts the same place that Conan does, born on a battlefield. But by the time he was out of his toddler years, he was scheming and avoiding schemes. And we don't know how young he was when he first killed someone, but it was very, very young. His voice had not changed. And he goes on in the course of his life. He's ousted from his native land. He's ousted from his native land and goes selling his sword, basically, and his military acumen and his ability to command men in any theater that would have him. And as a result, he's all over the world. He's all over the Western world, having adventures far, far from the frozen rivers of his homeland. And this is the story of that life. And Snorri Sturluson could also have a novel written about his life. His life was also larger than life as a person. It bothers me. This is a refrain that's going to run throughout my little Sagalong this time around. It's a familiar refrain in this channel just in general. It bothers me how poorly served this whole area of literature is. When is the last time that we saw, for instance, an 800-page popular biography of Snorri Sturluson? When is the last time we saw that? I can tell you when. It was never. and this is a literary figure on par with the greatest literary figures in literary history. And we know quite a bit about him. Where is that popular life in English? I've never seen it, much less more than one. Where is the popular, scholarly, accessible, school-worthy, big brick translation edition of Heimskringla? I've never seen it because it doesn't exist. That penguin, that old Dover was the closest that we've come, as far as I know, in English. And the same thing is true, unfortunately, of Harald Hardrada, who has had lots of biographies, but nothing in the way that, for instance, his near contemporary, like, for instance, the medieval figures of his day, of whom we know quite a bit, and who were real people. Unlike a lot of the other figures in Icelandic sagas, Harald Hardrada was a real person, and there are enormous numbers of records, comparatively speaking, to a lot of people, even in his own time. Where are his biographies? Where is the recent one? There's tons and tons of fiction, tons and tons of fiction about this person, starting here, starting with this. Snorri Sturluson does a great job of weaving in the high fantastical, the anecdotal that he knows perfectly well. Don't be fooled. Don't slip into historical condescension when it comes to figures like this. Snorri Sturluson knew a hack from a handsaw when it came to sifting through historical records. Granted, the systemization of writing and researching history was created by the Germans in the late 18th and 19th century, just like they created everything else in the late 19th and early 20th. The Germans created everything else at around the same time. Theories of music, theories of biology, theories of tectonics, theories of you name it, and they invented it. It's the price we pay for putting up with the rest of what they do. They're indispensable, but they can be annoying. And that can lead you to think that maybe it was all Wild West before then, and it wasn't. It wasn't at all. Don't slip and fall for that. Don't fall for it when it comes to Herodotus, for instance, who was also a mytho-historian, and don't fall for it when it comes to Snorri Sturluson. He knew perfectly well that that most of the stories that he writes about Harald in here had no verification. They just were good stories. And he makes a hemming and hawing occasionally, not all that often in this chunk, but in Heimskringla he's constantly talking about how he looked at the records, and this is his best account. And there were a whole bunch of writers at the time. History was being born. Our modern conception of history was being born at this time. So you get my beloved Gerald of Wales, you get the Venerable Bede, you get a whole bunch of people not only doing this kind of thinking about history, this kind of new thinking that would burst into sunlight in the Italian Renaissance, of, okay, never mind what people think they know, never mind what everybody's been told, what do we actually know about what happened in the past? What can we actually know from inscriptions, from monuments, from records, as opposed to what we all know? You know, what we all know is Romulus and Remus, but do we know that that actually happened at all? The Venerable Bede was fond of telling people that if you go to a counting house, you do not accept a myth about what money is there under your name. You want to know. You want to know that fact. And he said, he wasn't the first to say it, and he certainly wasn't the last to say it, and Snorri Sturluson said it all the time, that all facts are like that. What if all facts are like that? Then they can all be determined, and we can sift them and judge their comparative reliability. And he knew how to do that. He doesn't do that in this saga. The saga of King Harald is wonderful, wonderful reading, specifically because he didn't do that. And I know I'm on a bit of a Conan kick in 2019. There's a reason for that. I'm writing a long piece on Conan, and I'm being aided in that by tons of reprint material that's just coming up all the time about Conan. But Robert E. Howard was reverse engineering a version of the same prospect. He was taking the myth and introducing as much history as he could, and Snorri Sturluson takes the history as far as he knows it and introduces as much myth as he can. Either way, it makes for terrific reading. Now, this is where you're going to find Sagalong to be extra interesting, is you're going to get all the different personal reactions. I'd be willing to bet that most of my fellow Sagalongers will like this story. I'd be willing to bet that it comes out being their favorite so far, with a lot of them. I think that all that's going to go down in flames next time. Next time we're doing the prose edda, I think that's going to sweep everybody away. But there's a reason why that would elicit this book would elicit that kind of reaction, because it feels more like a story. It feels more to have a point to it. And the point is the whole of Harold's life, and the reason why it feels pointed is because it ends in a very dramatic way. It ends in the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. Because after a lifetime of treading the jeweled scepters of earth under his sandaled feet, Harold decides, once he reconquers his own homeland, he decides that that's not enough. And he sets his ambitions on a crown jewel of Viking conquest, which is to conquer England. And he assembles a huge force. They would have filled the horizon if you had been standing on the shore and seen them coming. The ships would have filled the horizon. And again, don't fall to historical hindsight and think about modern day battleships, or if you go to New York, you can see an older battleship that's moored right there. You can just stand there and look at it, and it's immense. It's immense. It's as big as a building, as big as a block of buildings. Don't be fooled by that into thinking that a fleet of Viking warships would not have looked terrifying. Believe me, they would have looked big and terrifying. And Harold led a vast fleet, 300 ships, tons and tons of men, and equipment and horses and whatnot, to make a full-blown attempt to conquer England. And he succeeded at first, of course, because these were the best warriors in the world. They swept their opposition aside in the 2 or 3 quasi-military encounters that they had at first. But unbeknownst to them, real resistance was coming. Another King Harald, the King Harald of England, King Harald Godwinson, was rushing north. He was force-marching his men north to meet this threat. And when they arrived, he gave them about 5 minutes to rest themselves, and then he ordered them to attack, and they slaughtered King Harald Hardrada and his men. Just slaughtered them. And that should have been the end of it. That was certainly the end of Harald, and that was the end of, as I mentioned a couple of days ago, when I was doing my Viking starter kit, that also in the common parlance, just the thumbnail, latecomers and stragglers notwithstanding, that also ended the Viking era, which is why it's so tempting for historical novelists to refer to Harald Hardrada as the last Viking, even though I would argue that what he was doing in 1066 was not Viking. He was attempting national conquest. He wasn't sailing out for booty, or to lay stake to a claim, or to extort money. He didn't want to do any of those things. He wanted to conquer England and rule it. But one way or another, that should have been the end of the whole problem for the other King Harald. but as fate would have it, just a little bit later, England was invaded again by William of Normandy. Not a huge force, fresh, whereas Harold had to turn his men around, exhausted men around, and march them back down to face another foe. And if that hadn't been true, if Harald Hardrada had been, for instance, content on his own throne, and there had been no invasion, no battle at Stamford Bridge, no forced march of dozens and dozens and dozens of miles, if instead William of Normandy had faced King Harald and his rested, perfectly situated, not exhausted troops, I myself think that things would have gone very differently. I myself think that invasion would have been repelled and probably discouraged for generations after that because of the fierceness of it. We saw already at Stamford Bridge that the English King Harold was pretty hard-rotted himself. I think the slaughter would have been awful at Hastings. And if William had been facing fresh troops, a tried and rested king, non-chaos. If he hadn't struck at the right time, I think things might have been very different. But the main point that I wanted to make about the read-along today, I know I'm wandering here and there because this thing always gets me thinking about history, and that's my main point, and it's another point that comes up on this channel quite a bit, which is that I don't think you can read King Harold's saga, the saga of King Harald Hardrada. I don't think you can read it and not feel directly what I talk about on this channel all the time, which is the incredible appeal of nonfiction. I was coming to that, I'm sure. I mean, Snorri Sturluson is an artist of the first rank, and in a lot of the stories and the maneuvers that he pulls in here, the narrative stuff, even in an English translation, you can tell that he is thinking long and hard about how he's arranging things and how he's laying emphasis. And that's all thrilling, but when it comes to something like the story of Harald Hardrada, he feels in the way. I'm wondering if you're reading along, I'm wondering if you felt the same way. If you felt like, well, okay, I'm reading this and it's a saga and it's definitely mytho-history and that's interesting in its own right, but this, more than the other two that we've read so far, is really making me want to pick up a biography, an actual history, and find out what we know, incorporating Snorri Sturluson's book as a brick in a wall to tell us what we actually know. That you're reading through here and you're thinking, okay, but in this instance, the real story would obviously be more interesting than this fictionalized version. I wish I could read that. I'm wondering if you had that reaction. I'm curious to know. I certainly did, but I'm prone to it. That won't be a problem next time. Next time we move on to the prose edda, and I believe next time is the last time. The last of Sagalong. And I could be wrong about that, but I think that we're ending with that. Whether we do or not, though, as far as I can remember, the prose edda is the only major work that we're dealing with this time around on Sagalong. Otherwise, it's all these smaller things, which are interesting in their own right. But we'll be moving on to that. Unfortunately, I don't think I have a Penguin Classic of the prose edda. I think I'm going to have to move on to something else. I think I have an Oxford translation. So annoying to be dealing with translations of these things, but especially since in this case, as in other cases, less so this one than others, the translation is turning out to be a live issue for me. I hate that, but I do love this event. I absolutely love revisiting this stuff. I am all in favor of doing this again next year. But in the meantime, that is going to wrap it up for the saga of King Harald Hardrada, for the saga of King Conan, who was a thief, a reaver, a slayer, a freebooter, and eventually a king through force of his own arms. It's literally better than fiction. So I'll wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.